If you walk through modern Tulsa today, you'll see wide streets, neat storefronts, clean sidewalks. It looks like any other American city. Quiet, efficient, polished. Glass reflects blue sky. People walk dogs. Cars idly turn through green lights. Coffee steam rises from paper cups. There is, at first glance, nothing to mark an earlier, more volatile century. But beneath those streets, under layers of concrete and time, lie ashes. Not the kind you sweep away, the kind that history tried to forget. The kind that once belonged to a city within a city, a place that had a name both proud and defiant, Greenwood. If you stand on Archer Street at sunset, when the light softens and the city seems to exhale, you might catch a whisper. It will not be loud. It will not come as a headline or a plaque. It will be small and persistent. The laughter that once filled the blocks, the rhythm of jazz through an open window, the shuffling steps of men and women who left work satisfied and returned to families secure in a community they had built themselves. Every story you'll hear here was lived by someone who worked, dreamt, and lost everything. If you believe their stories should never be forgotten, subscribe, not for the channel, but for the voices history tried to silence. Let's begin. 100 years ago, Greenwood was not merely surviving. It was thriving. Men wore pressed suits, women dressed in fine silks, and children carried books to schools that gleamed with pride. Barbershops buzzed. Bakeries set fresh loaves on wooden counters. Attorneys argued cases in offices above storefronts. The Dreamland Theater drew crowds for vaudeville and films. Doctors like A.C. Jackson practiced with a skill that drew patients from beyond Tulsa. The Stradford Hotel, built and owned by J.B. Stradford, offered a standard of hospitality that white establishments too often denied black travelers. They called it Black Wall Street, a name that carried both pride and promise. Here, wealth wasn't inherited. It was built. Brick by brick, store by store, idea by idea. The dollar changed hands and circled within Greenwood far longer than in many other neighborhoods. That circulation was the beating heart of a community that had learned to turn exclusion into a kind of self-sufficiency. But there's another truth whose memory the soil itself keeps. Under the same streets where laughter once echoed, charred remains rest. Wood turned to coal, iron twisted under heat. The silence of a city that burned in a single night sits heavy in the land. If you did not know what happened here, you might pass through without noticing. You might cross the same intersections, sip coffee from the same corner, and imagine this is what Tulsa has always been. You might be unaware that beneath your feet once stood more than 1,000 homes, dozens of churches, several schools, hospitals, newspapers, banks, theaters, and businesses, all wiped from existence in less than a day. Tulsa rebuilt itself, as cities often do. New buildings went up. New stories arrived. The city moved forward, resplendent and proud. And the ash beneath the streets remained, inert and patient, carrying the memory of what it had lost and what it had taken. Those ashes are not only history, they are a warning. They are a whisper from the past that says, prosperity built on resilience can still burn under envy. Before we talk about the flames and the ruin, before we say those names and those dates, we must return to the beginning, to Greenwood as it was before the fire, before the hatred, before Tulsa became shorthand for an erasure of possibility. Before the fire, there was Greenwood. The founder's name is an ordinary one in many histories, O.W. Gurley. That simplicity, though, masks a decision that would ripple for decades. Gurley arrived in Tulsa with savings and a plan. He bought land, 40 acres north of the Frisco Railroad tracks, and he set out to sell it to black settlers who wanted something that was rare in the early 20th century: ownership. Ownership promised an anchor in a country that frequently moved black people with a willing hand toward dispossession. Those who came were artisans and professionals, teachers and preachers, entrepreneurs and families. Many arrived from states that had been brutal to them: Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, places where the law was backed by terror. Oklahoma, recently opened to settlement through the chaotic politics of American expansion, offered a fresh, if precarious, landscape. People who might have been sharecroppers in their parents' generation could, if they survived the struggle, become landowners in this new place. Greenwood grew. It accreted structures and institutions like a city forming layers. A barber, a banker, a lawyer would open a shop. A doctor established a practice. A hotel was built for black travelers denied rooms in white hotels. The Tulsa Star printed the news and the opinions of a community that wanted to see itself reflected honestly. Churches became not only places of faith, but of organization and mutual aid. A hospital cared for children and adults who could not otherwise easily access care. The economy of Greenwood was remarkable, not because it was huge, but because it worked. Money circulated in tight loops. $1 paid a barber, and the barber spent it at a grocer who invested in a theater ticket. The kind of micro-circulation economists study today as a bulwark for community resilience. It was not a fantasy of overnight millionaires. It was steady, careful, and communal progress. That progress gave Greenwood residents the dignity that prosperity grants: stability, plans, the ability to educate children, to buy land, to form institutions that would outlast any one generation. On any given day, you could see the evidence. Men in suits walked down Greenwood Avenue. Ladies in their Sunday best entered the Dreamland Theater. Business owners counted receipts and invested. The Stratford Hotel hosted guests who would otherwise have been turned away elsewhere. The hope was palpable. People spoke openly of what they intended to do. They invested in the future. Underneath this hope was a different kind of knowledge, that reliance on one another was not only a virtue, but a necessity. Segregation had, in cruel irony, consolidated a certain form of economic insulation. When white-owned businesses refused black customers, black entrepreneurs stepped in to sell them food and services. When white banks denied loans, black-owned savings associations and cooperative lenders surfaced. Greenwood's residents were not blind to the outside world. They read newspapers, they followed politics, and they understood the limits imposed by Jim Crow. Yet they had constructed a place where limits could be defied through labor, collective action, and dignity. That defiance shone like a bright lamp. It was visible, perhaps unavoidably, to those who lived only a few blocks away across the railroad tracks. The other side of the tracks was a different Tulsa. White Tulsa had been enriched by oil discovery. Some white neighborhoods languished, but white entrepreneurs flourished. Many in white Tulsa were used to being at the center of economic life. The sight of a self-sufficient black community operating without white capital stirred a complicated mixture of reactions. For some, pride in Greenwood's success was genuine, even if uncomfortable. For others, resentment took root. It was easier for a society built on hierarchy to assume that something had been stolen, that access to prosperity had been illegitimate. Newspapers and gossip did their work. Stories that could be bent into narratives of threat or alarm found eager ears. The stage was set, and the resentment smoldered like a dry leaf near a match. This was the Greenwood that would not sleep on May of 1921, a place of families and businesses, of music and sermons, of hospitals and schools and ambitions. To understand what was taken, we need to live with the scene of its life. The clink of coin on the counter, the murmur of conversation, the fresh smell of bread from a bakery, the deliberate stride of men who had earned their bread through work and choice. That life would be broken not merely by violence, but by a set of systems of law, media, insurance, and silence that ensured the wound would last far longer than any blaze. There are no complete portraits that capture the texture of Greenwood's life. There are only fragments and the traces of those fragments. Still, to better understand the community, imagine a few lives woven together and returning often through our story. Imagine a barber whose shop sits on Greenwood Avenue. He opens at dawn, straightening his sign, arranging the chairs, polishing tools. Men come in and take seats, and conversation begins. News from distant relatives, gossip about municipal decisions, a local debate about a new teacher in the school. He knows which neighbor owes him for paying with a loan and who saves every week for a wedding. When he shuts up shop, he goes home to his wife and cat to discuss the small and crucial business decisions that help the shop live through lean months. Picture a teacher, a woman who walks to Greenwood School each morning. She carries a bag of books and a stern tenderness. She has prepared lessons that will open the horizon for children who didn't know what could be learned beyond the county. She spends her evenings grading papers and planning a modest fundraiser for supplies. She contemplates the bright faces of children and dreams for the first generation of Greenwood natives who will break through barriers. See a doctor, trained, careful, a steady hand who has won acclaim for his operations. Patients arrive not just from Greenwood but from neighboring counties. He has invested in a surgical lamp for better night procedures. He is married to the woman who helps balance the small private practice. Their conversations at dinner are about how to balance community needs with the rocky economics of serving people denied options elsewhere. These lives add up. They were small-scale prosperity. They were dignity. And they, more than any ledger, are what was stolen when the fires came. The immediate trigger for the massacre was proximate and short-lived, but the tinder predated it by years. On May 30th, 1921, a young black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered the Drexel building uptown to use an elevator. The operator was Sarah Page, a white teenage woman. We do not know with absolute historical certainty the details of that elevator ride. Accounts vary. Some claim Rowland tripped. Some say Page screamed. The ambiguity is, in a way, the most dangerous element of the chain. In a city already charged, rumor needed only a rumor to ignite reaction. By the next morning, the local white newspaper had published a short and inflammatory headline: "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." That headline did not report a settled fact. It pumped fear. The language, blunt, accusatory, dehumanizing, framed the event as a singular kind of aggression. Newspapers in this era were not neutral observers. They formed the air in which civic life breathed. The tone of a paper could shift how a city understood itself. As evening fell, a crowd gathered near the courthouse. Each new rumor swelled the mob. Men came with shotguns. Men came with hatchets. Words hardened into violence. Accounts are messy and contradictory, as they are in every chaotic event. What is clear is this: Greenwood residents, many of whom were veterans of the Great War and had learned to use weapons defending their country, understood the threat. They feared another lynching, another spectacle that would end in death and humiliate a community that had worked to build itself. Those veterans organized not for aggression, but for protection. About 75 of them marched to the courthouse. They reported to the sheriff that they would help maintain peace if needed. They wanted no bloodshed, only to protect Rowland from being summarily hanged on the steps while a mob looked on. The sheriff rebuffed some of their offers and tensions rose. The crowd outside swelled. Stories of black reinforcements, of a pending invasion, spread. Fear made monsters of shadows. What happened then? Who fired the first shot? Whether someone panicked or deliberately shot is debated. A scuffle, an accidental trigger, a terrified response could have been the single moment that shattered the evening. In the immediate aftermath, 10 people lay dead, and the city fractured into something worse. The mob left the courthouse and headed toward Greenwood. They broke into pawn shops and weapons stores and armed themselves. The theft of weapons magnified the scale of the violence. The mob became more than an angry crowd. It became an armed force, moving with purpose. Newspapers continued to feed the atmosphere, and the rumor economy turned horrific. That single elevator incident was shaping into a narrative of existential white fear. This is an important truth. The tangible cause was small compared to the story built around it. And the story, when told as a threat to civilization, can justify almost any action to those who believe they act in defense of a threatened order. The situation in Tulsa in those days reveals something deeper. The power of the press combined with pre-existing prejudice can convert an ambiguous event into state violence in moments. The spark was an elevator incident. The fuel had been decades of segregation, the rhetoric of racial inferiority, the failure of institutions to protect citizens equally. Once the match was struck, the rest of the night unfolded with chilling speed. If the spark was a match on dry leaves, the night that followed became an inferno. The coordinated fury that moved on Greenwood was not a spontaneous twitch of chaos. It had a forceful logic. People who wanted to punish what they felt was an affront to the social order, the site of black prosperity, arranged themselves with weapons and purpose. The sky over Tulsa was not a passive element. Planes, private biplanes, were commandeered by white pilots. They flew low across Greenwood, menacing the neighborhood with the threat of a new kind of warfare. Eyewitnesses would later testify that incendiary items, burning rags, perhaps even explosives, were dropped. The image of civilian aircraft used against civilians on their own soil is a painful and almost cinematic terror. Planes circulating like vultures while below buildings burned. In the streets, the violence was intimate and monstrous. Mobs entered homes, took jewelry and money, razed possessions to white-hot ruin. Businesses that had taken decades to build were consumed in minutes. The Dreamland Theater, a center of entertainment and joy, was reduced to smoke and char. Churches, sanctuaries where people found spiritual safety, were not spared. A doctor who stepped into the street with his hands up was shot dead in front of his home. Families fled without time to gather mementos, wedding photos, letters, the small articles that keep memory intact. Some residents hid in basements only to be smoked out. Others fled through alleys, stumbling over debris, carrying children on their backs. Men who had worked for years to build businesses and properties were dragged into the streets and threatened with death. Over 1,000 homes were burned. Countless businesses were gone. By dawn, 35 blocks were in smoldering ruin. Some estimates later placed the homeless in the neighborhood closest to 10,000. The official death toll published by the city was 36. Survivors and investigative historians believe the number of people killed in the massacre was far larger, perhaps hundreds. Bodies were thrown into mass graves or scattered in ways that made an accurate count difficult. The truth was not only the fire and the immediate loss, it was the aftermath, in which the systems that might have helped count and compensate were either absent or complicit. When the National Guard arrived, the scene did not immediately shift toward the protection of Greenwood residents. Instead, black Tulsans were disarmed and detained. Men were lined up and photographed, many taken to makeshift internment sites where they remained under guard. Those in charge treated the victims as criminals. The physical destruction is stark in itself, but to understand its full cruelty, one must imagine the moments inside it. A grocery owner who had counted on holiday sales to pay loans watched his livelihood collapse into ash. A teacher who had laid up a small savings for textbooks saw everything vanish. A pastor whose church had been an anchor for community aid watched as the place where those in mourning found comfort became tinder. Survivors later told of a sky peeled red by flame and smoke. Many described the sound as bewildering. Gunshots like wood being snapped, the roar of fire like a sustained ocean. In those hours, the logic of law had been replaced by the logic of mob. Law enforcement, when present, often failed to restrain. Some officers were accused of participating. In the center of it all, Greenwood burned. By the time the fires died, 35 blocks lay in ruins. The magnitude of material loss is staggering in raw numbers, but those numbers can feel abstract. Possessions can be tallied, but trust cannot. The people of Greenwood had lost not only property, but the accumulated trajectories of their families. The permits and deeds and receipts that tell the story of decades of careful work. Those items being destroyed meant their ability to prove ownership and to claim debts or insurance payments would be compromised for years to come. The National Guard's presence, the internment of Greenwood residents, and the city's slow response to actually protect the survivors set the path for the next, longer phase of harm, the legal and economic erasure that would ensure the wound endured beyond the ashes. There is a particular quality to the morning after such violence, an exhausted hush that is not solace. In Greenwood, the morning smelled of ash and something worse, disbelief. People walked through streets that were once full of life and saw only skeletons of buildings. Chimneys stood as forlorn sentinels. A small guitar left among rubble did not play again. Churches were still hot to the touch. Books were dampened and pages fused. Neighbors found one another with hands that trembled not from the cold, but from shock. Hushed voices asked small, practical questions. Where is my son? Who will help me with a roof? Who has a blanket to spare? In tents that were hastily set up for the homeless, people slept poorly. Children tried to make sense of a grown-up world collapsing in a way they had never imagined. Beyond the immediate human suffering, there was the sense that something structural had been broken. Insurance companies, those supposed guardians of property, announced that riot exclusions in policies meant they owed nothing for damage caused by riots. Policies designed to protect suddenly had loopholes to absolve responsibility. The city, which had an obligation to its citizens, did not move with urgency to rebuild. Instead, it introduced ordinances and zoning changes that made it harder, not easier, for Greenwood residents to re-establish what they had lost. In this silence, another violence began. The slow institutional denial of the community's right to compensation and remembrance. Words matter. When the event was called a riot, rather than an attack or massacre, the responsibility shifted. Victims became, in the civic rhetoric, complicit. Insurance became negotiable. Legal recourse became elusive. And long after the fires cooled, the fight to secure compensation, to find lost deeds, and to recover records became the next arena of struggle. The morning after revealed that the fire had been only the beginning. That beginning had been done with iron and flame, but the follow-up used ink and law to lock the wound shut. The phrase, "forgotten economic catastrophe," is not hyperbole. The economic mechanisms that translate labor into intergenerational wealth were dealt a near-lethal blow in Greenwood. Understanding how requires examining the systems that should have protected citizens and discovering how they failed to do so. First, consider insurance. Many Greenwood businesses had policies against fire. Insurance should have meant compensation for loss. Yet the policies had riot exclusion clauses, standard in many contracts, which insurers used to deny claims. The logic offered by insurers was simple: damage caused by riots is excluded. Yet it is reasonable to ask, if a mob burns your property, are you not entitled to recourse? Should those left homeless be expected to bear the cost of violence perpetrated in their neighborhood? Insurance companies paid white-owned businesses damages in other parts of the city. They did not pay Greenwood. That differential treatment is striking in both morality and consequence. When a high street storefront receives a check for repairs, while a Greenwood business receives a denial letter, the material gap in rebuilding prospects widens irreparably. Rebuilding without capital is possible, but it constrains ambition. Smaller shops reopen where hotels once stood. Wooden shacks replace brick facades. A hospital that once had specialized equipment never regains it. Second, consider record destruction. During the blaze, property deeds, business ledgers, and tax records were burned. When paper that proves ownership vanishes, the legal claim to property weakens. Courts, when presented years later with claims, found it difficult to validate ownership. The absence of proof provided convenient cover for those who would acquire land in the wake of the disaster. The disparities that followed were not mere accidents. They emerged from the power to claim and the power to prove claim. Third, The city's response was hostile to Greenwood's reconstruction in more subtle ways. City officials implemented tougher building standards, purportedly for safety and modernization, but in practice requiring materials and investments out of reach for impoverished survivors. Plots were rezoned for industrial use. Land that once sheltered homes was suddenly inconvenient for habitation in a bureaucratic sense. Imagine being told your house is gone, and the land beneath it will soon be a warehouse or parking lot, that the city's planning will make your return unlikely. The economic loss extended beyond property. Consider human capital. Greenwood's hospitals, schools, and businesses provided not only incomes, but training, apprenticeship, and social networks. The destruction severed these pipelines. A young person who might have apprenticed with a black dentist lost the mentorship that could have led to a professional career. A business that offered credit lines to black entrepreneurs ceased to be. The cumulative loss is hard to quantify but not ephemeral. Generations were denied the stepping stones that accumulate into middle-class stability. Historians and economists have tried to measure the damage. Estimates vary because the assumptions differ. Short-term destruction, long-term loss of opportunity, lost transfers of wealth to subsequent generations. Conservative calculations using replacement costs for structures and inventory paint a devastating picture. When scholars adjust for lost opportunity, the potential businesses that might have grown from capital retained instead of consumed by fire, numbers balloon. Some studies propose figures in the tens or hundreds of millions in today's dollars when considering the compounded effect over generations. Whatever the exact number, the impact shaped the economic trajectories of families for decades. There is also the intangible effect, the chilling message to black entrepreneurs across the South. Greenwood had been a model for what black autonomy might look like. Its destruction sent an unmistakable signal. To succeed too visibly could be dangerous. The cultural effect, the suggestion that accumulation and prominence are risky, sapped ambition. That psychological braking on aspiration, passed as caution to children and grandchildren, is a form of economic suppression that compounds over time. Policies that followed the massacre, from zoning to policing practices, continued to target black prosperity. Urban renewal projects later in the 20th century tore through parts of Greenwood. Highways and commercial corridors sliced neighborhoods, displacing residents in ways that rarely rebuilt wealth. The systemic pattern is clear. Violent dispossession followed by bureaucratic indifference produced a durable redirection of wealth away from a community that had generated it. Finally, consider the educational loss. Greenwood schools had provided a foundation. Scholarships and informal educational networks supported children into professions. The dislocation meant some families moved away or could not pay for continued schooling. The lost human capital compounds after a single generation. Children denied stable homes often have truncated academic tracks. For those who managed to get educated and remain, their prospects were nevertheless shaped by the scarcity of local mentorship and capital. This is what we mean by economic catastrophe. The interplay of immediate destruction, burned buildings and looted safes, with the longer arc of policies, insurance practices, and social forces that prevented recovery. The city did not simply incinerate houses, it incinerated plausible futures. Greenwood's people did not vanish into despair. They rebuilt again and again. Rebuilding was not simply a return to the old, it was an act of defiance. Within a few years, the community coaxed businesses back. A barber set up shop on a plank on a sidewalk. Women organized fundraisers in church basements to put a roof back over a family's head. A pastor offered his church as a temporary school. The Stratford Hotel reopened its doors, patched and smaller perhaps, but still a beacon for travelers. Those who had nothing else pooled what they could to offer loans. Mutual aid, a principle often discussed in theory, became a lived reality. The rebuilding was not the same. Confidence had been scarred. The capital base was reduced. Yet the fact of reopening mattered. Greenwood's revival was proof that the community was not finished. Yet that revival arrived in an environment still hostile to black success. One matter that punctuated this period was the legal struggle for recognition and compensation. Survivors took claims to courts. They filed suit against the city and insurance companies. The legal language of the time proved brittle and often indifferent. Claims were dismissed or ignored, and denials were rationalized. Appeals failed. The courts functioned, in many cases, as instruments of a system that prioritized continuity of the status quo over remedying the devastating harms. Despite institutional resistance, the people improvised. A local reverend might double as a banker. A small cooperative might offer scholarships. The economy adapted into solidarity-based structures. These forms of mutual support kept the embers of Greenwood alive. Then there were the quieter forms of resistance, teaching children to remember, to trace their family histories, to keep the narrative of Greenwood intact. Stories went from grandparents to grandchildren in quiet conversations. That cultural memory preserved the sense of identity that would later fuel memorialization and activism. The 1930s and 1940s saw Greenwood operating at some level of vibrancy again, though never on the scale it had reached before. The Great Depression and subsequent national turbulence changed the economic landscape for everyone. Still, Greenwood's recovery had a moral dimension. It showed that even in the face of violent dispossession and institutional denial, communities can and did persist. The resilience here is central, but it does not erase the injustice. The community rebuilt homes and businesses, but they did so without structural compensation, and often without the legal protections that would have enabled true restoration. That absence created a second story of grief, the knowledge that they had rebuilt by hand what they had previously built by hope and capital. The pain of the massacre did not simply fade, it was actively covered. For decades, the story of May 31st to June 1st, 1921, was omitted from school books and official histories in Tulsa. When people asked, they were told that such angry episodes were unhelpful to civic pride. Some historians and civic leaders preferred a narrative of progress and avoided confronting violent blemishes. The phrase race riot was often used in public documents to describe what happened. The term reframed agency. It suggested mutual violence, obscuring the clearly asymmetrical and racially targeted attack on Greenwood. Language shaped public perception. Calling what had happened a riot not only flattened nuance, it misassigned blame. The silence was enforced in different ways. Newspaper clippings disappeared. Photographs were lost or withheld. City archives had gaps. Survivors, many of them traumatized, told their children to forget rather than to tell. Some feared retaliation. Others simply wanted to move on and not relive the horror. The effects of that communal silence were profound. By erasing the event from public memory, the city protected an image of itself and allowed injustices to remain unexamined. In the meantime, scholars, journalists, and activists outside of Tulsa kept fragments alive. Books, articles, and personal testimonies circulated in black presses and among historians devoted to uncovering suppressed narratives. Yet for the mainstream public and most residents of Tulsa, the story remained almost invisible. The long silence had concrete implications. Without acknowledgement, there is rarely policy correction. Without record, there is rarely restitution. The absence of curriculum meant generations of Tulsans grew up ignorant. The erasure served as a second assault. Not only had the community been burned, but the public conscience had been trained not to see the burning. The moral and political consequences persisted. The 1960s and 1970s brought national attention to civil rights and to history often covered up in local narratives. Student groups and civil rights organizations began to ask hard questions. Still, it took many more years for Tulsa's mass to publicly confront its past. If forgetting is an act of choice, remembering is an act of courage. It is survivors and descendants who insisted upon such courage. They kept the story alive around kitchen tables, in church basements, and later on in print. It would take decades for the broader public and political institutions to pay attention. In the late 20th century, attention began to change. In the 1990s, the state of Oklahoma formally convened a commission to investigate the events of 1921. That investigation drew testimony from survivors who were then elderly, some in their 80s and 90s. Their recollections were vivid. They spoke of the planes overhead. They recounted acts of brutality. They described how the city had both participated and failed to act. Their voices, which had been hammered into silence for decades, now carried the weight of living testimony. The Commission's report confirmed many of the accounts that survivors had long told. It documented institutional failures and proposed reparative actions. Yet implementation lagged. Recommendations were often not translated into meaningful restitution. In the early 21st century, as public discourse shifted, driven by broader movements to confront racial injustices, Tulsa began to examine its past more publicly. Archaeological efforts sought graves. Researchers used modern techniques to find possible burial sites. Some mass graves were located. The physical discovery of remains brought a clarity that public record had not. It became impossible to keep the story sanitized or relegated to rumor. Survivors testified before Congress. Their testimony, simple and chilling, reminded the nation of what silence had allowed. Viola Fletcher, who was more than 100 years old, spoke and told of the smell of smoke and the image of bodies in the street. She said that she had lived through it every day. Her words carried moral force that statistics and documents cannot replace. Seeking justice took many forms. Lawsuits were filed. They met obstacles. Legal claims on behalf of descendants ran into statutes of limitation and legal doctrines that protect governmental immunity. The law, which is often a tool for social justice, showed its own blind spots. Courts, limited by precedent and formal requirements, often denied restitution because, in strict legal terms, the time for these claims had passed. Beyond litigation, Tulsa sought ways to remember. Memorials were created. Museums opened. Educational programs were introduced for new generations. The Greenwood Rising Museum, for instance, was established as a repository of artifacts and an educational hub. The public recognition helped spread knowledge beyond the borders of Tulsa. The centennial in 2021 brought national attention and renewed conversation. Yet even with memorials and museums, questions remain about what justice really requires. Is apology sufficient? Is a plaque and a museum enough? Or must a moral society try to restore what it took materially: land, capital, and opportunity? These questions are not only legal, they are moral and political. The debate over reparations and compensation speaks to what a nation owes to repair structural wrongs rooted in violence. Meanwhile, Greenwood's descendants continue to organize for recognition and compensated redress. They lobby city councils, speak at conferences, and seek policy changes that might begin to redress the historic wrong. Some efforts target education, ensuring the massacre is taught in schools. Others focus on economic policy, advocating for community investment, scholarships, and land restoration programs. The reckoning is partial and ongoing. It is incomplete precisely because the systems that distributed justice historically were slow and often resistant. The moral arc bends slowly, and even now the work continues. But the cracks in the wall of silence are real. The public record has been changed, and the voices of survivors have finally reached a broader audience. Years from now, if you walk through Greenwood and pay attention, you will hear echoes. They are not literal, but they reverberate in the names of streets, in ceremonies, in the faces of descendants who tell the story of grandparents and great-grandparents. The city is different. The skyline has changed. But memory persists, stubborn as a root breaking through concrete. Greenwood's story is not only about what was lost, it is also about what was built afterward, about the persistent human will to survive, teach, and remember. That will is not small. It has produced community centers, renewed interest in Black entrepreneurship, and a new generation that speaks openly about restitution and recognition. The massacre teaches a lesson beyond Tulsa. It shows how fragile civic promises can be when institutions of power choose to protect some and ignore others. It shows how insecurity, fear, and economic envy can be weaponized into violence. It shows how law and policy can be used to compound harm after violence has ended. Justice, if it is to be meaningful, must move beyond words. It should make room for structural policies that build capital, restore property, and redress educational and economic disparities informed by facts of history. Apologies are important. They name the wrong. But being named is not enough to heal the material deprivation that followed. Remembering Greenwood matters because it transforms an anonymized tragedy into the story of people: bakers, barbers, teachers, parents, and children. Remembering allows a society to ask not only what happened, but what will we do about it now? The answer to that question can take many forms: scholarship that honors the truth, educational programs that ensure future generations know, civic policies that invest in descendants, and a renewed commitment to equality. As we end, imagine again walking through modern Tulsa. The coffee steam lifts, the city hums. Yet when you cross certain blocks, when you pause and listen, there is a patient echo from another century. It asks that the story be told, that reparative action be considered, and that the memory of those who built so much on scarce resources be honored. They tried to bury Greenwood, but people do not disappear entirely. Memory, like a seed, can survive under ash and germinate years later in the hearts of listeners. Those who listen become the keepers of what was burned. They carry the work of ensuring truth is not merely spoken once, but learned and acted upon. This is not the end of the story. It is only a turning toward new demands of justice and memory. If the ashes beneath the streets taught one thing, it is that silence can destroy. Perhaps truth, persistent, loud, and relentless, can rebuild. You've been watching Shadow Chapters. We bring history's most haunting and powerful moments to life through immersive storytelling. Step into the shadows of the past and discover how they still shape the world today. And, if this moved you, share it. Help us keep their memory alive. Subscribe to the Shadow Chapters and join us as we uncover the truths that time tried to erase.